The neural network city of Synaptica was like a brain on caffeine, jittery, overactive, and prone to occasional shutdowns. Today, though, it was more like a brain on the verge of an aneurysm. Sirens blared. Holographic alerts flashed across streets, each more ominous than the last. The city's inhabitants bustled about, faces etched with the kind of existential dread usually reserved for tax audits and surprise visits from in-laws. Creighton, the diplomat with a penchant for sarcasm, stood in the main atrium of the Synaptica's central hub. His suit was a shade of gray that matched his outlook on life, which at that moment was as optimistic as a nihilist at a birthday party. "Is this what they call a mass extinction special? Buy one, get annihilated," Creighton quipped, surveying the panic with a detached bemusement. He had seen planetary crises before, but usually from the safety of a conference room with a nice cup of synthetic coffee. Beside him, Dr. Zeckler, a scientist whose hair looked like it was styled by an explosion, was tapping away at a data pad with the intensity of someone who didn't realize the solve all problems button was missing. "If only alien technology came with a manual," Zeckler muttered, "or at least some assembly instructions. Instead, it's like putting together an IKEA shelf in the dark." Creighton smirked. "With parts missing and a premonition that it'll collapse on you while you sleep. Sounds about right." Overhead, a holographic display cycled through images of ships, alien ships, each bristling with enough weaponry to make even the most seasoned warmonger reconsider their career choices. The stark reality hit like a punch to the gut. Humanity was faced with an enemy that had the technology to turn Synaptica and by extension Earth into a cosmic ashtray. "They call themselves the Varkan," Zeckler continued, eyes glued to the display. "Apparently their hobbies include knitting, long walks on the beach, and planetary obliteration." Creighton raised an eyebrow. "Well, at least they have hobbies." "We have that to look forward to. Priorities," Zeckler said, with a dry smile. "Maybe we can bond over a nice apocalypse." Further down the atrium, Vexy, a technician who could probably rig a toaster to contact Mars if she had to, was elbow-deep in the guts of a terminal, wires spilling out like metallic intestines. "Vexy," Creighton called, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew how to delegate responsibility away from himself. "Any good news out of that pile of spaghetti you're wrestling with?" Vexy glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she wiped grease on her jumpsuit. "Good news. We're not dead yet. Bad news. That's about to change if these circuits don't stop frying like bacon in hell's skillet." "Always with the optimism," Creighton said, nodding. "That's why we keep you around." The atrium was a hive of activity, with representatives from every corner of Synaptica buzzing about in a frenzy of conjecture and panic. The kind of collaboration that usually ended with everyone agreeing that they were, indeed, all screwed. "So what's the plan, genius?" Vexy said, gesturing to Zeckler while reattaching a particularly stubborn cable. "Or are we just going to sit here until they decide to rearrange our molecules?" "Well," Zeckler said, feigning contemplation, "we could always try diplomacy. Maybe invite them for tea and a chat about not wiping us out." Creighton laughed without humor. "Tea diplomacy. Brilliant. Next we'll solve overpopulation with a bake sale." "If the bake sale includes explosives, count me in," Vexy said, snapping the terminal shut with a decisive clang. "Let's not rule it out," Zeckler said. "Explosive cake could be a hit." Creighton sighed, looking out over the crowd. "It's a shame, really. I had such plans for retirement. A quiet asteroid, a good book, maybe not being vaporized by aliens." Vexy snorted. "Retirement's for suckers, and the dead, which might overlap sooner than expected." "Thanks for the pep talk," Creighton said, his tone dry as a bone. "Next you'll tell me that at least there's an afterlife." "Only if you believe in fairy tales," Vexy shot back, her hands already diving back into the terminal. The lights flickered ominously, an erratic heartbeat for a city on edge. In that moment the universe seemed to pause, as if taking a deep breath before the plunge. Creighton cleared his throat, forcing himself to stand a little taller. "All right, let's get serious." We need to figure out what in the universe these Varkin want, and how to convince them that Earth isn't the galactic equivalent of a sandcastle begging to be kicked over. And how do we do that without an alien Rosetta Stone? Zeckler asked, pocketing his data pad with a sigh. We improvise, Creighton replied with a shrug. The hallmark of human ingenuity, or desperation, Vexy said, focused on her task. Creighton nodded, a grim smile playing at his lips. There's a fine line between the two. As they huddled around a holographic table, examining alien blueprints that resembled an Escher painting designed by a sadist, a silence settled over them. It was the kind of silence that suggested no one quite knew what the hell they were doing. If they come in peace, Vexy mused, they've got a funny way of showing it. Peace is subjective, Creighton replied, eyes scanning the incomprehensible diagrams. Everyone's peaceful in their own story. And in yours? Zeckler asked. Creighton chuckled mirthlessly. Yours is a tragedy with extra sarcasm. The hubbub of the atrium faded into the background, a low hum of fear and speculation. It was in these moments of quiet contemplation that the weight of their predicament loomed largest. The Varkin, with their technological superiority and apparent lack of empathy, were a threat unlike any other. Humanity, with its penchant for chaos and resilience, had a fight on its hands. Time to earn our keep, Creighton said, straightening his tie, an anachronism he wore as a nod to old Earth traditions. Let's see if we can't talk our way out of annihilation. And if that fails, Vexy asked, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Creighton grinned, a twisted kind of hope in his eyes. Then we improvise with explosives. The three of them shared a look that was both weary and resolute, a silent acknowledgement of the task ahead, because in the great cosmic scheme they were but a blip, a whisper in the void. Yet, like all humans before them, they would not go gentle into that dark night. And as the lights flickered once more, a stutter in the heart of Synaptica, the three unlikely allies prepared to face a challenge that threatened to snuff out that whisper forever. The city of Synaptica hummed with an artificial anxiety, a digital hangover from a night spent running on fumes and desperation. In the heart of this neural network chaos, Creighton, Dr. Zeckler, and Vexy huddled around a tactical holo display, contemplating the latest cosmic punchline at humanity's expense. A new holographic alert flashed across the atrium, depicting an alien vessel that looked like God had lost a bet and was forced to design a spaceship after 5 shots of tequila. This was the Zenthari Collective, an alien force that seemed hell-bent on asserting dominance or, at the very least, demonstrating the limits of human comprehension. Looks like something you'd see in a bad sci-fi flick, Vexy commented, her expression caught between awe and disdain. All it needs is a sound effect like a whoopee cushion. They really do have a certain aesthetic, Creighton replied, crossing his arms as he stared at the ship's wild design. Like a Picasso painting that's been set on fire. And probably just as comprehensible, Zeckler added, tapping his data pad as though willing it to provide answers it simply didn't have. The Zenthari had sent an ultimatum. Not that anyone could read it. The message was a jumble of symbols and sounds that made the Rosetta Stone look like a primary school primer. Their cryptic demands were transmitted with the urgency of a landlord banging on your door for rent, yet as clear as mud. "Anyone here speak alien gibberish?" Creighton asked, glancing around at the gathered crowd, each face a portrait of confusion. "If it's not in binary, I'm useless," Vexy shrugged. "And even then I'd need a manual, preferably with lots of pictures, Doctor." Zeckler shook his head, a frown carving deeper lines into his already worry-creased face. "The Zenthari language is a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, thrown into a blender and set to liquefy. We're looking at this all wrong." "Oh, do enlighten us, Professor," Creighton drawled. "What insightful revelation have you pulled out of your metaphorical hat?" Zeckler ignored the sarcasm, lost in thought. "Maybe it's not about what they're saying. Maybe it's about how they're saying it. Like when someone screams fire in a crowded theater," Vexy suggested. "Exactly," Zeckler said, snapping his fingers. "The tone, the delivery, the context." We need to consider the frequency, pitch, the modulation. Ah, yes, Creighton interrupted. Because if there's one thing every diplomat relies on, it's the alien equivalent of elevator music. Well, it's a start, Zeckler countered, though his voice lacked conviction. Right now, I'd settle for a Rosetta Stone or a really, really good translator, Creighton said, his patience wearing thinner than his threadbare tie. The discussion was interrupted by a new holographic message, this time displaying a sequence of geometric shapes accompanied by a grating sound like a cat being strangled by a kazoo. As the symbols flickered, a disembodied voice rang out, distorted and alien. Well, at least they're trying, Vexy muttered, rubbing her temple as though the headache of interstellar diplomacy was a physical weight. Do we respond? Zeckler asked, looking at Creighton with a mix of hope and trepidation. Creighton considered the question, his mind a whirlwind of possible outcomes, none of which were good. Might as well. If we're going down, let's go down knowing we at least tried to talk our way out of it. So, what do we say? Vexy asked, her fingers hovering over the terminal, ready to make humanity's voice heard amidst the cosmic din. Something profound, Creighton mused. How about please don't obliterate us? We're really quite fond of existing. Or we could try humor, Zeckler suggested. Everyone loves a joke, right? Yes, but humor is subjective, Creighton said dryly. And given our audience, I'd say that's a riskier gamble than Russian roulette with a Gatling gun. Still, worth a shot, Vexy said with a shrug, keys clicking furiously as she typed out a message. Might as well see if they appreciate sarcasm. What did you write? Zeckler asked, peering over her shoulder. Vexy grinned, a devilish glint in her eye. Just a simple hello. We come in peace, mostly because the alternative is messy. Creighton chuckled despite himself. I knew there was a reason we kept you around. As the message was sent, the trio shared a moment of tense anticipation, each silently willing the universe to grant them one more chance at survival. The Zenthari response was immediate, their ship humming with energy as a new transmission came through. The symbols rearranged themselves into a sequence that, while still incomprehensible, seemed less aggressive. Looks like we've bought ourselves a little more time, Zeckler observed, relief mingling with apprehension. For now, Creighton said, the weight of the situation settling back onto his shoulders. But we're still in the dark, and I don't trust the Zenthari to keep the lights on out of the goodness of their hearts. We've got to learn more fast, Vexy said, her fingers already dancing across the terminal, pulling up every scrap of data they had on the aliens. The information was sparse, a collection of observations and half-baked theories that barely scratched the surface of understanding. The Zenthari's technology was astonishing, their ships capable of feats that defied human comprehension, and yet their motives remained an enigma, leaving humanity fumbling in the dark. Best-case scenario, Creighton said, his voice heavy with irony. They just want to exchange recipes. Worst case. Boom, Vexy finished for him, her voice laced with a dark humor that belied the gravity of their predicament. Which is why we need to find out what they really want, Zeckler said, his gaze fixed intently on the holo display as if sheer willpower could force it to reveal its secrets. Creighton nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities, each as bleak as the last. Agreed. We need to figure out what makes the Zenthari tick before they decide to tick us off the map. The city buzzed around them, a living organism on the edge of panic, its inhabitants caught in a dance of fear and determination. And amidst the chaos, Creighton, Zeckler, and Vexy pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to admit defeat, a grim determination to claw their way back from the brink. All right, Creighton said, his voice cutting through the din with the clarity of command. Let's divide and conquer. Zeckler, you keep working on the language. Vexy, see if you can hack into their systems, find out anything useful. I'll sit around and look pretty, Vexy suggested with a cheeky grin. Exactly, Creighton retorted with a smirk. And if you need me, I'll be over there having an existential crisis. With a shared grimace that passed for camaraderie, the trio set to work, each driven by the knowledge that their actions, however small, might just tip the scales in humanity's favor. As the Iors ticked by, the city of Synaptica pressed on, a fragile haven in a universe that seemed intent on swallowing it whole. And above, the Zenthari ships hovered, silent sentinels in the void, their intentions as inscrutable as the stars themselves. In the end, it was a battle of wills, a struggle to understand, to communicate, to bridge the chasm between worlds. And as Synaptica faced the threat of annihilation, its inhabitants stood firm, bolstered by the knowledge that even in the darkest Iors they were not alone. They had each other. And sometimes that was enough. Creighton leaned against the cold, steel wall of their makeshift command center like a man who just found out his credit card had been maxed out by an ex he thought he broke up with a decade ago. So, what's the plan? Begging or bribery? Vexy looked up from her terminal, a smirk tugging at her lips. Neither. I'm thinking more along the lines of chaotic incompetence. It's a strategy that's worked for us so far. The all-accidental genius approach. I like it, Creighton replied, rubbing his chin as though contemplating the mysteries of the universe, but probably just wondering if he could get away with not shaving for another week. Doctor. Zeckler, perpetually looking like he was one bad day away from a full-blown existential crisis, peered over his data pad. It's not incompetence. It's adaptive strategy, Creighton snorted. Call it what you want, Doc. I call it winging it. The Zenthari ships floated ominously above Synaptica, every sensor bristling with an eagerness that suggested they'd been waiting centuries for an excuse to blow up a planet just to see what happened. And yet, here they were, stymied by a species that couldn't decide if double chocolate chip was a flavor or a lifestyle. You know, Vexy began, tapping away at her terminal with the speed of a cheetah on caffeine. If we can't work their tech to our advantage, maybe we can make them work around Iors. I mean, look at us. We're a walking, talking, technological mess, great. So we confuse the hell out of them with our outdated software and non-intuitive UI, Creighton said, a wry grin on his face. It's not a plan. It's a shit show, Zeckler sighed. Our tech is primitive compared to theirs, but maybe that's our edge. They'll underestimate us, or obliterate us, Vexy added with a shrug. But hey, let's focus on the positive. She shot Creighton a grin that was equal parts defiance and mischief. Meanwhile, the Zenthari were slowly starting their descent, their ships casting shadows long and deep over Synaptica. The holographic alerts now played like some demented 80s disco light show, flashing warnings in colors that suggested whoever programmed them desperately needed to lay off the LSD. So, what exactly are we doing? Creighton asked, his voice laden with the kind of skepticism that comes naturally when your life is on the line, and the plan involves a lot of guessing. We're going to introduce them to the glitch, Vexy said, her fingers still dancing over the keyboard with all the grace of a seasoned pianist performing a particularly avant-garde piece. It's a little virus I whipped up that doesn't do much, except introduce infinite pop-up ads. They'll be too busy trying to close windows to launch an attack. Creighton blinked. You're joking, right? Do I look like I'm joking? Vexy replied, deadpan. Zeckler frowned, though there was a twinkle in his eye. It's as good a plan as any. Besides, if they are as advanced as we think, this'll be like throwing a wrench in a hyper-digitalized machine. Or we turn their ships into very expensive paperweights, Creighton said with a shrug, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. Honestly, I'd pay to see that. As Vexy prepared to deploy her cyber gremlin, the Zenthari ships loomed closer, their sleek designs marred by the electronic equivalent of acne. Lights flickering, systems stuttering, and the unmistakable sound of an alien attempting to navigate through a barrage of congratulations. You've won messages. The first ship stuttered in its descent, halting midair with all the grace of a drunk flamingo attempting a pirouette. The second followed, its elegant glide disrupted by systems going dark, and then blaring back to life in a cacophony of alarms. The Zenthari fleet was having what could only be described as a collective aneurysm. Well, that's one way to introduce ourselves, Zeckler murmured, half in awe, half in disbelief. Creighton chuckled. You know, I'm starting to think we might survive this after all. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Vexy cautioned, though her grin betrayed a flicker of hope. There are still a dozen ways this could go horribly wrong. Yeah, but at least it'll be entertaining, Creighton replied, crossing his arms as they watched the Zenthari ship scramble to regain control, their once menacing presence reduced to a slapstick comedy routine, albeit with a much higher potential for collateral damage. As the Zenthari struggled to salvage their dignity, Synaptica's citizens watched the spectacle with a mix of confusion and amusement. They'd gone from impending doom to cosmic farce in the space of a few ridiculous minutes. You know, if this works, we should write a book, Creighton said, eyes still fixed on the floundering ships. Call it How to Survive the End of the World with a Computer Virus and a Sense of Humor, Vexy snorted. And the sequel, Galactic Diplomacy for Dummies, Zeckler, ever the realist, sighed. Let's not start celebrating yet. If the Zenthari can adapt as quickly as we think, we won't have much time before they're back on track. The trio knew he was right. The Zenthari, for all their current confusion, were not to be underestimated. And once they figured out the source of their chaos, retaliation would come swift and merciless. We need to keep them guessing, Vexy said, her brow furrowed as she sifted through potential next steps. If they think this is just one of many attacks, they might waste more time trying to anticipate our non-existent master plan. So, we keep them busy with phantom threats while we scramble to find a real solution, Creighton summarized, his mind already racing ahead. Exactly, Vexy affirmed. Meanwhile, I'll be working on something a bit more substantial. Just make sure it's less likely to backfire than this, Zeckler cautioned, gesturing at the chaos outside. Hey, the chaos was the plan, Vexy shot back, though there was no mistaking the tension in her voice. The stakes were high and there was no room for error. Creighton clapped his hands, a sharp sound that broke the charged silence. All right, let's keep this show on the road. Zeckler dived deeper into their language. Maybe there's a clue we missed. Vexy, keep up the digital assault. I'll supervise with your usual skepticism, Vexy suggested, typing furiously. Exactly, Creighton replied with a grin, and maybe grab a coffee. We're gonna need it. The trio fell into a rhythm, each focused on their task, each aware of the fragile thread upon which their survival hung. Outside, the Zenthari ships continued their floundering ballet, a monument to human ingenuity, or insanity, depending on who you asked. Creighton watched the display with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Against all odds, they'd managed to buy themselves a little more time. Time to plan, time to adapt, time to, well, not die horribly. And given the circumstances, that was a victory in itself. As the Iors passed, the Zenthari ships slowly began to regain control, their systems gradually shaking off the digital assault. But in the chaos, something unexpected happened. The Zenthari began to communicate, their distress signals turned into messages, desperate pleas for understanding in a language still foreign but now tinged with a hint of desperation. They're trying to talk to us, Zeckler said, his eyes widening as he parsed the modified signals. I think. They want a truce. A truce? Creighton repeated, incredulous. You mean we actually confused them into wanting to talk peace? Their systems are still struggling, Zeckler explained, his voice tinged with both excitement and caution. They can't fight and decode our language at the same time. Vexy raised an eyebrow. So, they're calling a timeout because they can't handle the spam, looks like it, Creighton said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. This might be our chance to negotiate, Zeckler nodded, his mind racing. We just have to make sure they don't figure out how basic our attack was. Right, because nothing screams advanced civilization like pop-up ads, Vexy said, rolling her eyes. Hey, it worked, didn't it? Creighton retorted, unable to hide his amusement. The Zenthari's unexpected move had opened a door they hadn't dared hope for, a chance for dialogue, for diplomacy, for survival. It was a long shot, but it was a shot nonetheless. All right, Creighton said, taking a deep breath. Let's prepare our response. We've got to make them think twice about starting anything before they've had their morning coffee. Zeckler nodded, eyes glued to his data pad as he worked to decode the latest transmission. If we can just find a way to show them we're not a threat, or at least that they'd be better off not picking a fight with us, Vexy added, her fingers still flying over the terminal. Creighton chuckled. Let's hope they appreciate our brand of diplomacy. The trio worked tirelessly, each driven by the knowledge that their actions could mean the difference between peace and destruction. As the first glimmers of dawn broke over the city, the Zenthari ships hovered in a tentative stillness, their threat momentarily diffused by human ingenuity, or perhaps sheer dumb luck. With any luck, they'd survive to see another day. And if not, well, at least they'd go out knowing they'd made the universe's most aggressive tech support call. The Zenthari ships, previously stuck in their pirouetting mess, seemed to find their second wind, or maybe they just rebooted. Either way, their lights stopped flickering like a dodgy nightclub, and they began to regroup. Meanwhile, Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler holed up in their makeshift headquarters, a grimy room that may have once been a janitor's closet. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and desperation. So, any chance we can convince these guys we're a harmless backwater? Creighton asked, leaning against the peeling wall, arms crossed. Sure, Vexy replied, not looking up from her terminal. Right after we sell them perpetual motion and snake oil. Great, just making sure we're all on the same page. That being the page labeled screwed, Creighton said, rubbing his temples. Zeckler glanced over his data pad, where he'd been working on translating the latest Zenthari signals. They're escalating. I think they're deploying some advanced tech. Our little virus might have been more of a pebble in their shoe than we thought. Pebble. More like a damned boulder, Vexy quipped. I guess they're not fans of the click here to win a free iPad approach. Creighton pushed off the wall and moved to the holo display, studying the Zenthari ships as they shifted formation. Yeah, well, let's just hope their new tech isn't the obliterate everything from orbit kind. Even as he spoke, the Zenthari began to emit an eerie green light, like they'd watched too many bad sci-fi movies and decided lime green was the new black. The light pulsed, radiating across the planet's surface like an alien music festival no one wanted to attend. Advanced tech indeed, Creighton muttered. Any idea what it does? Nope, Vexy said. But I'm sure it's not a peace offering. Zeckler looked through his translations, brow furrowed. It's some kind of disruption field. I think they're trying to throw off our communications. Standard alien protocol, I'm sure, so they think we're smart enough to warrant jamming. That's flattering, Creighton replied dryly. Hey, maybe they're just big fans of our chaos strategy, Vexy said with a smirk. Either way, we need to adapt, and fast, Zeckler said, his fingers flying across his data pad. Vexy paused, tapping her chin thoughtfully. What if we use their own tech against them? Ever the optimist, Creighton said, watching her work. Got anything specific in mind, or are we just going to wing it like usual? Well, they're clearly trying to disrupt us, Vexy began, her voice tinged with mischief. What if we amplify their disruption field and turn it back on them? Give them a taste of their own medicine, amplifying alien tech with human junk. What could possibly go wrong? Creighton said sarcastically, though there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Plenty, Zeckler replied, but there was a resigned determination in his tone. But it's not like we have many options, right? Let's give it a shot, Creighton said, rolling up his sleeves. Worst case, we fry their circuits and iors. Best case, they go home with their tails between their proverbial legs, more like tentacles, but I get your point, Vexy said, already typing away. As they worked to cobble together a response, the oppressive hum of the Zenthari's disruption field grew louder, vibrating through the walls like the bass line of a particularly obnoxious neighbor's party. The kind where they'd show up uninvited and drink all your beer. So, how do we actually do this? Creighton asked, eyeing the mess of wires and circuits Vexy was assembling. Easy, Vexy said, her grin wide and slightly manic. We take their signal, boost it with our servers, and send it back. It's like returning an unwanted gift but with more explosions. Explosions I can get behind, Creighton said, helping her connect the final components. Zeckler, meanwhile, was busy deciphering any useful tidbits from the Zenthari's ongoing transmissions. They're getting frustrated. Their messages are becoming more frantic. Good, that means they're not as in control as they pretend, Vexy replied, flipping the final switch on their makeshift contraption. The device hummed to life, a low thrumming sound that made the hair on the back of Creighton's neck stand up. And if this doesn't work, well, Vexy said with a shrug, at least we'll have tried, comforting Creighton deadpanned. On 3 then, 1. 2, Vexy counted, her finger hovering over the button. 3 they said in unison and she pressed it. There was a moment of tense silence, followed by a low rumble as the device did its work. Outside, the Zenthari's green glow flickered, stuttering like a bad fluorescent bulb. It's working, Zeckler said, eyes wide. Their systems are faltering. Let's just hope it holds, Creighton added, watching the display with bated breath. The Zenthari ships wobbled in their formation, lights dimming as their tech sputtered under the unexpected backlash. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like they might actually have the upper hand. Well, I'll be damned, Vexy said, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. We might just pull this off. Creighton allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Against all odds, we're still here. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Zeckler cautioned, though his tone had softened. This could be temporary. Of course it's temporary, Creighton replied. But temporary's better than nothing. As they watched the Zenthari struggle, their own makeshift contraption began to emit a worrying smoke. A reminder that human tech wasn't meant for this kind of abuse. We've bought ourselves some time, Vexy said, backing away from the smoking device. Time we need to use wisely. Agreed, Creighton said, turning to Zeckler. Any progress on that translation? Not yet, Zeckler admitted. But I'm getting there. Then we keep pushing, Creighton said, determination set in his jaw. We keep adapting, keep them off balance. We're not out of this yet, Vexy nodded, already diving back into her terminal, fingers a blur. Just another day saving the world with duct tape and dreams. Add a little sarcasm and you've got the perfect survival kit, Creighton quipped. The Zenthari ships continued to flounder, their lights flickering as they tried to regain control. Around them, Synaptica's citizens watched with cautious optimism, aware that today's victory was fragile at best. Creighton felt a surge of pride, misplaced or not, as he glanced at his companions. They were a ragtag team of scrappy survivors, doing the impossible with the improbable. We'll keep them guessing, Vexy said, her voice confident. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come out of this intact. Intact is good, Creighton agreed. Intact means we live to fight another day, so what's next? Zeckler asked, looking to Creighton for guidance. Creighton shrugged, a lopsided grin on his face. We keep being ourselves. Irritating, unpredictable, and just smart enough to be dangerous. Sounds like my kind of plan, Vexy said with a laugh. Together they watched as the Zenthari ships began to retreat, their systems still struggling under the weight of human ingenuity, or was it idiocy? Either way, it was working. For now, they had won a small, significant victory. One that offered a glimmer of hope in a universe that seemed hellbent on crushing it. So, how does it feel to be a hero? Creighton asked, turning to Vexy. Vexy grinned. Feels pretty damn good, actually. Let's not get used to it, Zeckler warned. The universe has a funny way of balancing things out, true, Creighton said. But for now, I'll take this win. As they stood together, the sun began to rise over Synaptica, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was a new day, one that promised both danger and opportunity. And for Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler, it was another chance to defy the odds, to survive in a cosmos that seemed to have it out for them. A chance to prove that even in the darkest corners of space, humanity was here to stay, stubborn, sarcastic, and irrepressibly alive. The once muted hum of the Zenthari ships loomed louder than the existential dread gripping Synaptica. Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler were back in their grimy headquarters, which still reeked of burnt coffee, desperation, and the faint smell of duct tape. "Status report," Creighton said, leaning on a piece of wall that had somehow managed to remain upright despite the universe's best efforts. Vexy looked up from her terminal, eyebrows raised. "You want the bad news or the worse news? Surprise me." "The Zenthari have decided to up the ante," she said, tapping a series of keys with the precision of a caffeine-fueled squirt. "They've got a new party trick, something big and black like the universe's worst magician. Let me guess, a weapon," Creighton said, rolling his eyes as if that weren't the most predictable move in the alien playbook. "The biggest damn weapon this side of the galaxy," she replied, deadpan. "They're prepping a black hole generator. Of course they are," Creighton muttered. "Why obliterate a planet with lasers when you can suck it into a void of nothingness?" Zeckler, hunched over his data pad, looked up with the kind of expression one reserves for discovering their lottery numbers were one digit off. "A black hole weapon. That's ambitious. Even for them. Well, as far as doomsday devices go, it's got style," Vexy noted. Creighton surveyed the holo display, where the Zenthari ships had arranged themselves like a cosmic firing squad, each bristling with enough firepower to ensure everyone on Synaptica had a very bad day. "Morale's gonna take a hit when word gets out." "Morale's already in the basement, Creighton," Vexy said, not without a touch of bitterness. "Now it's digging into the bedrock." "Lovely," Creighton sighed. "Any ideas on how to stop them short of divine intervention?" Vexy shook her head. "Not a damned clue. In the absence of gods, we'll have to rely on fools, and that's pretty much us," Creighton quipped. Zeckler rubbed his temples as if trying to massage some semblance of hope back into his skull. "We need a plan. Something more sophisticated than our usual wing-it-and-pray strategy." "Hey, winging it got us this far," Creighton said, half smiling. "Barely," Zeckler replied, eyes flicking back to his data pad. Outside, Synaptica's citizens milled about in a haze of uncertainty. They were used to the planet's usual chaos, but this was something else entirely. Holographic alerts flashed ominous messages across the streets, each more dire than the last, as if the universe was determined to prove pessimism was the only valid worldview. Creighton turned back to Vexy. "Can we at least get a message through that disruption field?" "Working on it," she replied, fingers flying over the terminal. "But it's like trying to send a postcard through a hurricane." He sighed. "And here I was hoping for better news." Zeckler's face lit up, not with hope but with the gleam of a man who had, against all odds, found a lifeline in the middle of the ocean. "I might have something. Don't keep us in suspense," Creighton urged. "Well, our virus did more than just annoy them. It left a back door open. If we can get a signal through, we might be able to rig their systems to implode." "Implode?" Vexy repeated, skeptically. "Are we talking about a software crash or cosmic fireworks?" "Hopefully the latter," Zeckler said, though his expression suggested he was hoping for anything less catastrophic than their annihilation. Creighton nodded, a semblance of hope flickering in his eyes like a poorly maintained light bulb. "All right, let's give it a shot. We've got nothing to lose except everything." Vexy grinned, albeit sardonically. "Our mission statement. Everything to lose, nothing to gain but survival." "Catchy," Creighton replied dryly. "Get that on a t-shirt." As they worked to finagle a message through the Zenthari's disruption field, the pressure in the room mounted, the kind that made you want to leap out of your skin and run for the hills, if there were any hills left to run to. "Any luck?" Creighton asked, as Vexy continued her high-stakes digital ballet. "Almost there," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "If I can just—" A burst of static spat from the terminal, followed by a garbled message that sounded like a mix of angry cats and a fax machine on its last legs. "Well, at least they're picking up," Vexy said, with a grimace. Zeckler adjusted a few settings, his expression one of intense concentration. "Okay, send the command." "Command sent," Vexy confirmed, hitting the button with the enthusiasm of someone placing a risky bet. For a moment, nothing happened. The tension in the room grew, a palpable force that made breathing feel like a chore. And then outside, the sky began to ripple, like a stone skipping across the fabric of reality. The Zenthari ships shuddered, their formation faltering as the black hole generator flickered, stuttering like a dying engine. "It's working," Zeckler said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "For now," Creighton added, ever the realist. "Let's see if it holds." The ships continued to tremble, and for a moment it seemed like they might collapse under the weight of their own ambitions, taking their doomsday weapon with them. But then, as if the universe decided they hadn't suffered enough, the Zenthari fleet stabilized, their systems recalibrating with frustrating efficiency. "Damn it," Vexy cursed, slamming her fist on the terminal. "They're rallying." Creighton took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Then we keep fighting. We've bought ourselves a little more time, and we're going to make it count." "Time for what?" Zeckler asked, looking to Creighton for direction. Creighton smiled, the kind that said he had already resigned himself to their fate but was stubborn enough to keep going anyway. "Time to do what we do best. Improvise, that's your plan," Vexy said with a snort. "Improvise, it's worked before," Creighton replied with a shrug. "For how long?" Zeckler challenged, his voice cracking under the strain. Creighton met his gaze, unflinching. "For as long as it takes." As they prepared for another round of human ingenuity versus alien superiority, Synaptica's citizens huddled together, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Fear was a palpable entity, drifting through the streets like an unwelcome guest no one had the guts to evict. Vexy, cracking her knuckles, grinned with more than a hint of madness. "Let's give him hell." Creighton nodded, his determination infectious. "Hell's exactly what we've got in spades." They went back to work, each moment a borrowed breath in the face of a seemingly insurmountable threat. The Zenthari ships loomed large, a reminder that even the most stubborn humans had limits, and those limits were rapidly approaching. But as they continued to fight, to push back against the darkness threatening to consume them, it was clear that defeat was not an option they were willing to entertain. Not while they still had air in their lungs and ideas in their heads. And as the sun set on Synaptica, the sky painted in the dark hues of an uncertain future, Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler found themselves once again on the precipice of oblivion, unwavering, irreverent, and annoyingly persistent. "Any final thoughts?" Creighton asked, breaking the silence. Vexy chuckled, a sound that carried more defiance than humor. "Yeah, let's make sure they remember us." "Remember what?" Zeckler asked, half joking. "That we didn't go quietly," Creighton answered, resolute. "That we fought, kicking, screaming, and laughing in the face of doom." With that, they plunged headfirst into the next chapter of their battle, determined to prove that even in a universe eager to snuff them out, humanity could still shine. It was a small, stubborn light, flickering against the vastness of space, but it was theirs, and they'd defend it to the end. The makeshift headquarters buzzed with a tension that could make a Zen monk anxious. Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler were clustered around Vexy's terminal, which was currently doing its best impression of a light show gone wrong. Creighton's expression suggested someone who'd just found out their favorite pub was out of beer. "As far as potential catastrophes go, this one's got a hell of a light display," Creighton noted, watching the screen flicker ominously. "Yeah, if you like your fireworks with a side of doom," Vexy replied, her fingers dancing over keys like a pianist in the middle of a breakdown. She paused, a peculiar look crossing her face. "Hold on. What the hell?" "Not good, Vexy." "Not good at all," Creighton said, already imagining the worst. "Words you never want to hear from your tech expert." "No, it's just—" "Well, this can't be right," Vexy muttered, leaning closer to the screen as if proximity would make numbers make sense. "This data says their black hole generator's got a malfunction, some kind of feedback loop." "Feedback loop?" Zeckler echoed, disbelief evident. "You're saying their planet buster might implode on itself. That's convenient," Creighton snorted. "Convenient doesn't even begin to cover it, more like bloody miracle." Vexy frowned, skeptical but intrigued. "Look, I know it sounds nuts, but the readings indicate a vulnerability, something that could be exploited if we could figure out how." Zeckler shook his head with a wry smile. Only in our line of work is exploit the enemy's failure to not destroy themselves a valid battle plan. Hey, if the shoe fits, Creighton said, shrugging. Besides, when has anything straightforward ever landed in our laps? Vexy tapped a few more keys. We need to verify this isn't just some cosmic joke at our expense. You mean like our whole existence? Zeckler quipped, fiddling with the data pad. Just another day in the absurdist drama we call life. Focus, folks, Creighton interjected, his voice a notch more serious. If there's a flaw, we need to exploit it before they figure out we're onto them. They returned to the screens, the room's dim light barely enough to ward off the promise of total obliteration hanging over their heads. Okay, let's see what we can do here, Vexy said, her focus absolute, all sarcasm temporarily shelved. If I can just reroute this. A new cacophony of beeps erupted from her terminal and Vexy's look of triumph mixed with disbelief. Got it. The data suggests a resonance frequency in their generator that could destabilize it. English, please, Creighton requested, crossing his arms. Think of it as hitting the right note to shatter a particularly nasty piece of glass, Vexy explained. Except the glass is a weapon capable of swallowing planets. So, what you're saying, Creighton began, rubbing his temples, is that our best bet is to play DJ and hope we hit their 1 weak spot. Pretty much, Vexy replied with a grin. Good thing I've always had a knack for breaking things. Zeckler chuckled, though his eyes were still glued to the data pad. You sure this isn't just a trick? I mean, it could be a trap. Trap or not, it's the only shot we've got, Creighton said, exhaling slowly. Unless someone here has a better idea. The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the equipment and the distant, ominous thrum of the Zenthari ships in orbit. All right, Zeckler sighed, resigned to their fate. What's the worst that could happen? We die. At least we can say we went out with style. Spoken like a true defeatist, Vexy quipped, rolling her eyes. Call me realistic, Zeckler shot back, a smirk tugging at his lips. I've seen our odds. Creighton clapped his hands, the noise sharp in the small space. Let's do this. Vexy, you've got the controls. Zeckler, keep an eye on their systems. I want to know the second they catch on. They worked with the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb squads and last-minute term papers. Every keystroke, every adjustment was a step closer to delivering a cosmic middle finger to the Zenthari. Think they know we're up to something? Vexy asked, glancing at a secondary screen displaying the alien fleet. Let's hope they are as clueless as they look, Creighton replied, watching the ships for any sign of change. That's comforting, Zeckler muttered, his face illuminated by the glow of his data pad. The fate of our planet resting on the incompetence of our adversaries. Vexy punched a final sequence into the terminal. All right, we're set. On my mark. Now, the room fell silent as they waited, each second stretching into eternity. Outside, the sky seemed to hold its breath, the Zenthari ships a silent threat against the backdrop of infinite space. Then, a ripple of energy spread from the alien fleet, subtle at first but growing in intensity. The black hole generator, once a silent sentinel of doom, began to waver, its core vibrating with a resonance that threatened to tear it apart. It's working, Zeckler said, disbelief tinged with awe. It's actually working. Good, Vexy said, her voice firm. Now let's hope it keeps working. The skies above Synaptica were a spectacle, the kind that would make for a hell of a bedtime story if anyone survived to tell it. The Zenthari ships quivered, their formation breaking as they struggled to maintain control over their own weapon. Think they'll remember this one? Creighton asked, watching the display with cautious optimism. If they do, I hope it's with screaming, Vexy replied, her eyes glued to the terminal. Screaming and a side of embarrassment. The ships continued to tremble, but the Zenthari were nothing if not persistent. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to regroup, their systems adapting to the chaos. Damn resilient bastards, Zeckler said, shaking his head. They don't know when to quit. Neither do we, Creighton replied, a determined edge in his voice. We've bought time. Let's make it count. Vexy glanced at the clock, aware of every tick that brought them closer to either salvation or annihilation. So what's the next move? Creighton rubbed his chin, gears visibly turning behind his eyes. We keep throwing them off balance, keep them guessing. Sounds like a plan, Vexy said, the sarcasm back in her tone. A vague, terrible plan, but a plan nonetheless. Zeckler was already pulling up new data, searching for any additional weaknesses. Maybe we can disable their communications, create enough internal chaos to throw them off. Creighton nodded. Let's make their own tech work against them. If we can keep them distracted, we might just find a way to finish the job. They set to work with renewed vigor, the weight of the stakes tempered by the thrill of the challenge. The Zenthari might have been advanced, but humans had a knack for turning the improbable into reality, usually with a lot of swearing and duct tape involved. As the minutes slipped by, the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of desperate survival to determined defiance. They might have been the underdogs, but they weren't going to go down without a fight. Vexy was furiously typing, a whirlwind of motion and ingenuity. If I can just hijack one of their relay drones, we might be able to create a feedback loop in their comms. And if it doesn't work, Zeckler asked, his tone half joking, half serious, then we'll give them one hell of a headache before we're done, she replied, grinning despite the circumstances. Creighton leaned back, arms crossed. All right, let's make it happen. If nothing else, we'll make sure the Zenthari remember the day they tried to mess with Synaptica. Their confidence, however forced, was infectious. Even as the odds remained daunting, the spark of possibility was enough to keep them fighting, keep them hoping. With each passing moment, they chipped away at the seemingly insurmountable challenge, bit by bit. The Zenthari might have had the tech, but humans had a certain stubbornness that no amount of advanced weaponry could quite match. As the hours ticked by, the citizens of Synaptica waited, hearts heavy with the knowledge that their fate was being decided in a grimy room that still smelled like burnt coffee. Any last words, just in case? Zeckler asked, glancing between his companions. Vexy shrugged. Just one screw him, Creighton laughed, a genuine hearty sound that echoed in the cramped space. I think that sums it up nicely. And so they continued, with the kind of reckless tenacity that defined humanity's best and worst traits. As the Zenthari ships loomed above, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes, Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler pressed on, determined to turn the tide against all odds. Even in the darkest moments, hope flickered, refusing to be snuffed out by the weight of impending doom. It was a fragile thing, but powerful in its persistence, much like the ragtag team working against the clock. As the battle for Synaptica raged on, the outcome remained uncertain, a question mark looming over the future. But for now they fought, and that was enough. Enough to hold back the darkness for one more day, to stand defiantly against the tide. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Creighton leaned back in his chair, arms folded behind his head, a smug grin etched on his face. The grimy headquarters, with its burnt coffee smell and flickering lights, was a far cry from the pristine command centers you'd see in a holoflick. But then again, those holoflicks never had to deal with the Zenthari. With their alien ships bristling with weaponry capable of turning planets into burnt toast, the stakes were as high as they were absurd. So, what's our next move in this suicide mission? Creighton asked, breaking the silence, his eyes flicking between Vexy and Dr. Zeckler. Vexy sat hunched over the terminal, fingers dancing across the keys in a frenzied ballet of desperation. Well, we play on our greatest strength, she said, not looking up. Our stupidity. Creighton feigned shock. Speak for yourself. I prefer to think of it as accidental genius, or adaptive strategy, Doctor. Zeckler chimed in, though his gaze was distant, lost somewhere between existential dread and mild annoyance. But yes, stupidity works too. The terminal beeped, a sound that had become both their nemesis and savior. Vexy's brow furrowed. All right, I've managed to hijack one of their relay drones. We might be able to create a feedback loop in their comms. Creighton arched an eyebrow. And that's good because, Zeckler interrupted, finally tearing his gaze from his data pad, it'll confuse the hell out of them. like a swarm of drunk bees trying to dance a tango. You paint quite the picture, Creighton said, rolling his eyes. All right, let's see if we can make those bees sting. Outside, the Zenthari ships continued their menacing ballet, oblivious to the chaos being orchestrated from the planet below. The sky, a canvas of looming darkness, was interspersed with the occasional flicker of alien light, each pulse a reminder of the impending doom. "Think they'll notice our little stunt?" Vexy asked, glancing at the secondary screen. Creighton shrugged, nonchalant. "If they do, at least we'll know they're paying attention." "Comforting," Zeckler muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nothing like dying in the spotlight." Vexy punched in a final sequence, the room holding its collective breath. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that could be sliced with a rusty butter knife. "All right, here goes nothing." The terminal hummed to life, its screen awash in a chaotic light show that mirrored the turmoil of their situation. A ripple of energy shot out across the void, a digital shout in the silence of space. For a moment, nothing happened. The Zenthari ships hovered, their alien majesty unmarred by the antics of the humans below. Then, like a drunken buffalo, the fleet began to stagger, its once precise formation dissolving into a mess of confused signals. "It worked," Zeckler breathed, disbelief mingled with a dash of awe. "They're actually fighting themselves." "Well, fighting themselves or practicing a new dance routine," Creighton quipped, eyes glued to the display. "Either way, I'm not complaining." As the Zenthari ships continued their erratic waltz, Creighton felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous feeling but one that had kept humanity pushing against the odds since the dawn of time. "Time to hit them where it hurts," he said, voice filled with the kind of reckless bravado that was either genius or madness. "Vexy, see if you can mess with their targeting systems. Let's make sure they can't tell which way is up." "Consider it done," Vexy replied, her fingers a blur on the keyboard. Outside, the spectacle intensified. The Zenthari, unused to human interference, were scrambling, their advanced technology crumbling under the weight of its own complexity. A chink in the armor, a tiny flaw in the grand design, amplified by the human propensity for chaos. "Think they'll ever figure out how we did it?" Zeckler asked, his eyes still scanning the data pad for any signs of a Zenthari counterattack. Creighton chuckled. "If they do, let's hope it's too late for them to do anything about it." Vexy was already working on the next step, her focus unwavering despite the mounting tension. "I've got access to their comms. We can feed them false data, keep them chasing their own tails." "Good," Creighton said, nodding. "Let's make it so they can't hit the broadside of a barn. Or, a planet," Vexy added with a smirk. For a few precious moments, the balance seemed to tip in their favor. The Zenthari, mighty and implacable, were faltering, their own technology turned against them. It was a victory, albeit a temporary one, but in the grand scheme of things, it was enough to keep them fighting. But victory had a way of making its own enemies. Guys," Zeckler said, his voice tinged with the kind of panic that made stomachs drop. "I think they just figured it out." Creighton turned, his eyes narrowing as he watched the alien fleet begin to regroup, their systems adapting with chilling efficiency. The Zenthari were nothing if not tenacious. "Plan B?" Vexy asked, her voice steady despite the shift in momentum. Creighton sighed, rubbing his temples. "Plan B is the same as Plan A, only with more swearing." The Zenthari ships, no longer floundering, had begun to realign, their targeting systems zeroing in on Synaptica with renewed focus. The black hole generator, once a teetering mess, was stabilizing. "Well, it was fun while it lasted," Zeckler said, glancing at the clock, aware of every second slipping through their fingers. "Fun's not over yet," Creighton replied, a determined edge in his voice. "We just need to give them another nudge." Vexy's eyes lit up with an idea, her fingers already typing before she spoke. "If I can reroute their power systems, create a surge, it might just overload their main conduits." "And that would do what exactly?" Zeckler asked, skepticism lacing his tone. "Turn their generator into a fireworks show," Vexy replied, grinning. "Think of it as a cosmic middle finger, Creighton laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that cut through the tension. "Let's light it up." With renewed vigor, they set to work. The Zenthari might have had the tech, but humans had a gift for improvisation, especially when backed into a corner. It was a dance of desperation and determination, each keystroke a step closer to rewriting the rules. As the seconds ticked by, the Zenthari ships closed in, their weapons trained on Synaptica. The threat of annihilation loomed large, but so did the spark of defiance that had brought them this far. "Ready?" Vexy said, her voice a calm amidst the storm. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, she hit the key and the room seemed to hold its breath. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The Zenthari ships pressed forward, their systems a blur of efficiency. Then, like a symphony of chaos, the generator began to waver. Energy arced across the alien fleet, a cascade of white-hot light. "It's working," Zeckler said, all eclipsing his disbelief. "It's actually working." The black hole generator, once a harbinger of doom, was now a ticking time bomb, its core vibrating with a resonance that threatened to tear it apart. The Zenthari, masters of technology, were caught in their own trap. "Think they'll remember this one?" Creighton asked, watching the display with cautious optimism. "Oh, they'll remember," Vexy replied, her voice firm. "Remember the day they got outsmarted by a bunch of apes?" As the Zenthari ships quivered, their formation breaking under the strain, Creighton felt a swell of pride. Illogical, perhaps, but fitting for the moment. "We did it," Zeckler whispered, his tone a mix of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." Creighton clapped a hand on Zeckler's shoulder, a grin splitting his face. "Not too shabby for a bunch of idiots, huh?" Vexy laughed, a sound filled with triumph and a touch of hysteria. Idiots who just saved the planet. The Zenthari, once a looming threat, were now a testament to their own hubris, their weapon turned against them by the very species they sought to obliterate. "So what now?" Zeckler asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Creighton shrugged, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "Now we wait for them to lick their wounds and think twice before messing with us again." Outside, the skies above Synaptica were a spectacle, the kind that would become legend if anyone survived to tell it. The Zenthari ships, their majesty tarnished, retreated, a fleet of defeated conquerors. "And if they do come back?" Vexy asked, though her tone was more curious than fearful. Creighton smirked. "Then we'll just have to remind them why we're the most dangerous idiots in the galaxy." The makeshift headquarters, its air still thick with the scent of burnt coffee and victory, was quiet once more. But in that silence, there was a promise of resilience, of defiance, of humanity's unfaltering spirit in the face of the impossible. As the Zenthari ships disappeared into the star-studded void, Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler remained, a trio of unlikely heroes in a universe that never seemed to run out of surprises. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem quite so bleak. "Well," Zeckler said, breaking the silence with a wry smile, "at least we didn't die." "Not yet anyway," Vexy added, her grin matching his. Creighton laughed, the sound warm and full of life. "There's always tomorrow." And with that they settled into the quiet aftermath, their victory a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope has a way of finding its way through. As the universe continued its eternal dance, the three of them sat together, united in their defiance, ready to face whatever came next. For now, that was enough. The makeshift headquarters buzzed with a strange energy, something between a hangover and a miracle. The smell of burnt coffee clung to the air like a bad mood at a family reunion. Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler had pulled off the impossible, and now in the aftermath they were left wondering what the hell to do next. "Well, that was something," Creighton said, slumped back in his chair, looking like a man who just survived an unexpected roller coaster ride. "I vote we celebrate with the last of the synth brew." "Celebrate?" Vexy asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean drink ourselves into a stupor before we realize the Zenthari might decide to come back once they've licked their wounds?" "Exactly," Creighton replied, a lopsided grin spreading across his face. "It's what heroes do." Zeckler snorted, still fiddling with his data pad, probably searching for a shred of sanity among the chaos. Heroes. More like idiots who got lucky. Potato, potato, Creighton said with a wave of his hand. Victory's still victory, even when it's wrapped in a big, dumb accident. The makeshift headquarters, which had seen more panic than reason, was quiet now. Outside, Synaptica was slowly waking up to the fact that it was still very much in one piece. The holo displays were broadcasting the news, the flickering lights for once delivering something other than existential dread. "Look at him," Vexy said, nodding at the holo display showing jubilant crowds. "They actually think we knew what we were doing," Creighton chuckled. "If only they knew winging it was our official strategy." Zeckler glanced up, eyes narrowing. "Official? There's nothing official about what we just pulled off. More like divine intervention from the gods of chaos, or sheer stubbornness," Vexy added. "Humans are nothing if not annoyingly persistent." Creighton took a sip of the stale coffee, grimacing. "Here's to being annoyingly persistent, then." Out in the streets, Synaptica's defenders were embracing their unexpected survival. Celebrations erupted, fueled by relief and a heady mix of leftover adrenaline. For now, the threat of annihilation felt like a bad dream, the kind that fades with daylight. "So, where do we go from here?" Zeckler asked, breaking the silence with a question that loomed as large as the Zenthari ships once had. "Forward, I guess," Creighton shrugged. "Isn't that what we do? Survive one disaster, then stumble right into the next." "Sounds about right," Vexy mused, her fingers still dancing over the terminal keys, more out of habit than necessity. "Can't help but wonder if our collective incompetence is a strength, though," Zeckler chuckled, shaking his head. "Strength? More like a liability we managed to weaponize." "Hey, whatever works," Creighton replied. "We might not be the smartest species in the universe, but we're definitely up there in the most stubborn category." The room fell into a comfortable silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. The reality of their victory was still sinking in, the absurdity of it almost laughable. 3 humans against a technologically superior alien race, and somehow they'd sent the Zenthari running. "Think they'll come back?" Vexy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Probably," Creighton said, leaning back with a sigh. "But next time they won't underestimate us." "Next time," Zeckler echoed, the words hanging in the air like a promise and a curse. Creighton stood, stretching out the kinks in his back. "Until then, we celebrate. I hear there's a party starting down in Sector 3. Might as well pretend we're normal for a bit." Vexy grinned, rising to join him. "Normal, that's a stretch." "Normalish, then," Creighton conceded, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. Zeckler hesitated, glancing between the door and his data pad. "Go on," Vexy nudged him. "We've earned a break." "All right," Zeckler relented, standing with a sigh. "But if anyone asks, I still think we're idiots." "Noted," Creighton laughed, leading the way out of the grimy headquarters and into the night. Sector 3 was buzzing with life, the air filled with laughter and music. People gathered in clusters, talking animatedly, their expressions a mix of disbelief and joy. For the first time in a long while, the weight of the impending doom had been lifted. Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler made their way through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces, each one a survivor of a battle that should have ended differently. The relief was palpable, a shared feeling of gratitude for another day. "Hey, Creighton," someone called, raising a glass in their direction. "Didn't think we'd see you here." "Couldn't miss the party," Creighton replied, accepting a drink from a passing stranger. "Figured I'd see what the fuss was about." The stranger laughed, clapping him on the back. "Fuss? We just made history, showed those alien bastards not to mess with Synaptica." "Yeah, well, let's not get too cocky," Zeckler interjected, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. "We got lucky this time." "Lucky, smart, or just stubborn," Vexy added with a shrug. "Take your pick." The crowd erupted into laughter, a sound that was warm and infectious. For the moment, the tension of the past few days faded into the background, replaced by a camaraderie born from shared survival. As the night wore on, Creighton found himself standing on a makeshift stage, a drink in one hand and a microphone in the other. The crowd quieted, turning its attention to him, waiting for whatever pearls of wisdom he might offer. "All right, listen up," Creighton began, his voice carrying over the noise. "I know we've been through hell and back, but here's the thing. Humanity's got this funny way of surviving when we shouldn't." The crowd murmured in agreement, eyes fixed on him. "We might not have the fancy tech or the advanced ships, but what we do have is grit. And sometimes that's enough to turn the tables." Cheers erupted, and Creighton couldn't help but smile. "So here's to us," he continued, raising his glass. "The most stubborn, chaotic bunch of idiots in the galaxy." The toast was met with laughter and applause, glasses clinking in a chorus of defiance. It was a moment that would be remembered long after the stars had faded, a reminder of what it meant to be human. As the celebrations continued, Creighton rejoined Vexy and Zeckler at the edge of the crowd. "Think they'll remember this one?" he asked, echoing the question from earlier. "They better," Vexy replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Or we'll just have to remind them." Zeckler chuckled, shaking his head. "And if the Zenthari come back, we'll be ready." "Ready or not," Creighton said, a wry smile on his lips. "Either way, we'll give them a run for their money." The three of them stood together, taking in the scene around them. Synaptica was alive with celebration, the fear and uncertainty momentarily forgotten. It was a victory, however fleeting, and it was theirs. For now, that was enough. The night stretched on, the stars above twinkling with a kind of indifferent beauty. Creighton, Vexy, and Zeckler remained, a trio of unlikely heroes in a universe that never ceased to surprise. And as the music played and the laughter echoed, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was surviving against the odds. With a final look at the sky, Creighton raised his glass once more. "To the future," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "For better or worse." The toast was met with cheers, a promise to face whatever came next with the same stubborn determination that had seen them through this time. As the night faded into dawn, Synaptica stood, resilient and defiant, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who called it home. And while the Zenthari might return, Creighton knew one thing for certain. They'd be waiting, ready to remind the universe why humans were the most dangerous idiots around.